their heads supported with inflated water-skins tied under their jowls, were made to swim across the river by the local Shukriya Arabs. Such was the skill of these tribesmen that only one camel and one mule were drowned during the operation. The passage was completed on the 16th, and the next day the advance was resumed along the west bank of the Atbara. At midday on the 18th Mugatta was reached, and at dawn on the 20th the little force, having filled their water-skins, tightened their belts, and invoked the assistance of the various gods they worshipped, started off and marched all day in single file through the thick bush which lies between the Atbara and Gedaref. The column retired to rest peacefully during the night of the 21st, although within 12 miles of Gedaref. But at midnight startling news arrived. A deserter from the Dervishes made his way into the camp and informed Colonel Parsons that the Emir Saadallah awaited him with 3,500 men 2 miles before the town. The situation was grave. A retreat through the broken country and thick bush in the face of a powerful and triumphant enemy seemed impossible. There was no alternative but to attack. Very early on the morning of the 22nd, the same day on which General Hunter on the Blue Nile was compelling Musa Digna and his followers to surrender, Colonel Parsons and the Kassala column set forth to march into Gedaref, and to fight whatever force it might contain. For the first 2 hours the road lay through doura plantations and high grass which rose above the heads even of men mounted on camels. But as the town was approached, the doura ceased, and the troops emerged from the jungle on to an undulating moorland with occasional patches of rushes and withered grass. At 7:30, and about 3 miles from Gedaref, the enemy's scouts were encountered. A few shots were fired. The soldiers pressed their march, and at 8 o'clock had reached a small knoll, from the top of which an extensive view was obtainable. The column halted, and Colonel Parsons and his officers ascended the eminence to reconnoitre. A most menacing spectacle confronted them. Scarcely a mile away a strong force of Dervishes was rapidly advancing to meet the invaders. 4 lines of white figures rising out of the grass showed by their length the number, and by their regularity the discipline, of the enemy. The officers computed the strength of their antagonists at not fewer than 4,000. Subsequent investigation has shown that the Emir Saadallah marched out of Gedaref with 1,700 riflemen, 1,600 spearmen, and 300 horse. The swiftness of the Dervish advance and the short space that intervened between the forces made it evident that a collision would take place within half an hour. The valley was rocky, and overgrown with grass and reeds, but to the right of the track there rose a high saddleback hill, the surface of which looked more open, and which appeared to command the approaches from Gedaref. The troops knew nothing of the country. The Dervishes understood it thoroughly. The high ground gave at least advantage of view. Colonel Parsons resolved to occupy it. Time was, however, very scanty. The order was given, and the column began to double across the valley towards the saddleback. The Dervishes, perceiving the nature of the movement, hurried their advance in the hope of catching the troops on the move, and perhaps of even seizing the hill itself. But they were too late. Colonel Parsons and his force reached the saddleback safely, and with a few minutes to spare climbed up and advanced along it in column in the direction of Gedaref, the Arab battalion leading, the 16th Egyptians next, and last of all the irregulars. The Dervishes, seeing that the troops had already reached the hill and were moving along it towards the town, swung to their left and advanced to the attack. Thereupon, at 8:30, the column wheeled into line to meet them, and standing in the long grass, which even on the summit of the hill was nearly breast-high, opened a heavy and destructive fire. The enemy, although suffering severe loss, continued to struggle bravely onward, replying vigorously to the musketry of the soldiers. At 9 o'clock, while the frontal attack was still undecided, Colonel Parsons became aware that a strong force of Dervishes had moved round the left rear and were about to attack the hospital and transport. He at once sent to warn Captain Fleming, R.A.M.C., who combined the duties of medical officer and commander of the baggage column, of the impending assault, and directed him to close up the camels and meet it. The Arab sheikhs, who in the absence of officers were acting as orderlies, had scarcely brought the news to Fleming when the Dervish attack developed. The enemy, some 300 strong, rushed with great determination upon the baggage, and the escort of 120 Arab irregulars at once broke and fled. The situation became desperate, but Ruthven with 34 Supply Department camelmen hastened to meet the exultant enemy and protect the baggage column, and the transport was stubbornly defended. In spite of all their efforts, the rear of the baggage column was broken and cut up. The survivors escaped along the saddleback. The British officers, with their small following, fell back towards the main body, hotly pressed by the enemy. At this moment Captain Ruthven observed one of his native officers lying wounded on the ground, about to fall into the hands of the Dervishes and perish miserably. He immediately went back and, being a man of great physical strength, carried the body off in his arms. The enemy were, however, so close that he was 3 times compelled to set his burden down and defend himself with his revolver. Meanwhile, the retirement towards the main body continued and accelerated. Colonel Parsons and his force were now between 2 fires. The frontal attack was within 200 yards. The rear attack, flushed with success, were hurrying impetuously forward. The defeat and consequent total destruction of the Kassala column appeared certain. But in the nick of time the Dervish frontal attack, which had been suffering heavily from the fire of the troops, wavered, and when the Arab battalion and the 16th Egyptians advanced upon them to complete their discomfiture, they broke and fled. Colonel Parsons at once endeavoured to meet the rear attack. The Arab battalion, whose valour was more admirable than their discipline, continued to pursue the beaten enemy down the hill, but the 16th Egyptians, on being called upon by their commanding officer, Captain McCarroll, faced steadily about and turned to encounter the fresh attack. The heavy fire of the regular battalion checked the Dervish advance, and Captain Fleming, the rest of the dismounted camelmen, and Ruthven still carrying his native officer, found safety in their ranks. For his gallantry on this occasion Captain Ruthven has since received the Victoria Cross. A short, fierce musketry combat followed at a range of less than 100 yards, at the end of which the assailants of the baggage convoy were completely repulsed. The action was now practically over, and success was won. The Arab battalion, and those of the irregulars that had rallied, advanced and drove the enemy before them towards Gedaref, until, at 10 o'clock, both their front and rear ranks having failed, the Dervishes abandoned all resistance and a general rout ensued. No cavalry or artillery being available, further pursuit was impossible. The town of Gedaref surrendered at noon. The Dervish Emir, Nur Angara, who with 200 black riflemen and 2 brass guns had been left in command of the garrison, made haste to submit. The remainder of the Dervishes, continuing their flight under the Emir Sa'adallah, hurried to tell the tale of defeat to Ahmed Fedil. The casualties suffered by the Kassala column in the action were severe in proportion to their numbers and the duration of the fight. The 7 British officers escaped untouched, but of the 1,400 soldiers and irregulars engaged, 51 were killed and 80 wounded, a total of 131. The Dervishes left 500 dead on the field, including 4 emirs of rank. The victory had been won, the enemy were routed, and the town was taken. It had now to be defended. Colonel Parsons took possession of the principal buildings and began immediately to put them in a state of defence. This was fortunately an easy matter. The position was good and adaptable. It consisted of 3 large enclosures, capable of holding the entire force situated in echelon, so as to protect each other by their fire, and with strong brick walls 6 feet high. All were at once set to work to clear the approaches, to level the mud houses without, and to build ramparts or banquettes within the walls. The 3 enclosures thus became 3 forts, and in the principal work the 2 captured brass guns were mounted, in small bastions thrown out from the north and west corners. While the infantry were thus engaged, Ruthven and his camelmen made daily reconnaissances of the surrounding country,